I just want to practice use of the gong. We're going to start our questions and answer session now, and Peter and Saji are sitting there looking forward to spending the next 3/4 of an hour answering questions. So I'd like to sort of go around the tables as much as possible, so we'll take as many questions as we can. So.
Thank you, George. I am the facilitator for table number 11, and some members of the table wanted to ask the panel, have they any views on what lessons can possibly be learned on global warming from the hype surrounding the ozone layer in the past? And some of the members of the table just kind of wanted to know your opinion, or have you any views on that? Thank you.
The ozone layer.
Yes. Shall I kick off?
Yeah.
Yes. I know well Professor Susan Solomon, who has done great service both on the ozone hole problem and also actually on the climate change problem. She was the co-chair of the 4th assessment report working group 1 that I worked on. And I heard that there was recently a celebration of some of the scientists about the Montreal Protocol and the international efforts that were made as a result of the science that she and other scientists were involved in, discovering the ozone hole, and then, of course, understanding what had caused it, because when it was discovered, the full processes, the full scientific understanding wasn't there, so the scientists had to go away and develop that understanding and understand about the role of polar stratospheric clouds and the role of CFCs and these chemicals that when they were emitted, everybody thought they were totally inert and totally safe. But the point was that there was the Montreal Protocol, and then very quickly there was an international agreement to phase out these CFCs. There were alternatives were found. The industries involved actually had to make a major change in the way they did things. And now in the geophysical system, we are seeing the ozone hole recovering. That has started to recover. So I think there is a lesson there. It shows it can be done. It shows that governments can get together, countries can get together and agree what to do. And of course, the point about that was that it only works if everybody does it, so it shows that's possible. I think, though, you do have to acknowledge that the ozone hole was a simpler problem than the climate change problem, because although the industry did need to change the way things were produced, there were alternatives that were developed. So I think we also have to recognise that it is a beacon of hope, but the climate change problem is a harder problem to solve.
Saji, would you like to add anything to that?
It's not really my area of expertise, but there has been a change in the circulation patterns in the lower stratosphere, and as of now, it's not very clear if that was propagated because of the changes that's happening in the troposphere. So this is related to what you call as the quasi-biennial oscillation, which is a change in the polar vortex, which is normally seen during wintertime in the Arctic.
Very good. I'll take another question now. Okay.
Hello, panel. I'm the facilitator for the citizens in table 14. I have 2 questions. I'll put them one at a time for the panel. The first question is, based on previous historical predictions, how accurate were the earlier test predictions for the recent years up to 2017, and in particular to the extreme weather Ireland suffered in 2009, 2010 and 2011?
Yeah. How accurate?
I must admit, I didn't quite get the very last part of that question. Could you just repeat the very last bit about
the table? They're curious about how accurate were the earlier weather projections for recent years up to 2017, but more particularly Ireland suffered extreme weather in 2009, 2010 and 2011. And did that show in any of the historical projections for that time frame?
Could I start? Maybe I started with a more global context and then pass over to the Irish context. Is that?
Yeah.
I might proceed, because I just want to make a point about the climate predictions overall. Is that, and IPCC has looked at this actually. If you go back and look at the early climate model predictions, which are now, gosh, at least 2 decades. So back in the early 1990s, and you then compare those projections because they made assumptions about emissions, but if you compare those with what has actually happened, you'll see that the models and the observations agree in that intervening time. And as I said, when I talked about European summer temperatures, in effect, when we wrote that paper in 2004, thinking about European temperatures in summer, the prediction that we made back then has been borne out by reality. So both in the European and the global context, the climate models have been verified. They've been shown to be accurate in that sense.
Yes. Saji, in relation to Ireland?
In relation to Ireland, I think the temperatures have been very close to what was predicted in earlier simulations.
And just the second question was, the citizens at the table were curious about, they were given a lot of information regarding what will happen over 30, 40, 50 years. They were curious as to what is the worst case scenario in the short term, be it 10 to 20 years, as to what could happen regarding climate change and extreme weather.
So that's a really good question. So we've done some. So in my talk, I referred to the National Flood Resilience Review, and this is, apologies, this is a bit UK-centric, but it's some work that I'm familiar with. But I made the point that the flooding that we saw in the UK, and particularly in Cumbria and the borders of Scotland, was a real wake-up call, if you like, because it showed how vulnerable that we were. And the government commissioned something called the National Flood Resilience Review. And actually, we did some work at the Met Office where we looked at that question in terms of worst case scenario, because that was exactly the question that the UK government had asked UK scientists in this context. So it's a really good question. In order to answer it, you need to go and do some analysis, and we did that. And we basically looked at the chances of. So the point to make here is that when we look back at observational data and we look at the worst case in the observation, so we look at the records, and we might think that is the way that we need to look at a record rainfall, or we need to look at record temperatures. But the problem is that what we've seen in the past doesn't necessarily provide a good indication for the future, because climate is changing. And so we did an analysis of this, and we looked in the climate models, and we saw there was quite an appreciable chance that over the next 10 or 20 years we could exceed the rainfall that we saw in the 15-16 winter by more than 30%. And there was an appreciable chance of that happening. So that was the way that we answered that worst case scenario in the context of the United Kingdom. That then gave us estimates of what that would mean for flooding. And to be very specific now, and you do have to be specific in when you answer these sorts of questions, and so we looked at, for example, the catchment area of Exeter. We looked at other catchment areas as well, and we looked at what that would mean if we had a 30% more rainfall. And we saw that there were many thousands of homes that would be flooded under that event. That basically, although we've built flood defences in that particular catchment to protect us against what we might think of as normal climate, under our changing climate, if we break the record by 30%, then we see many more thousands of homes at risk. So that's one example of how to answer that question.
Thank you very much. Savi?
Yeah. In relation to temperature, if you look at the records since 1960, in the Irish context, out of the 10 highest annual temperatures, 7 has occurred after 1990. So from the model simulations, it's quite obvious that the extremes in temperature are going to happen and continue to happen like this. So in the near future, like we should be expecting more of the high temperature events.
Have we, and this may not be within the scope of Met Éireann's work, but have we considered doing a national flood resilience review, having regard to the flooding in 2013 and 14 and the recent flooding in Donegal?
At the moment, Met Éireann, until recently, Met Éireann was not responsible for the flood forecasting or anything to do with it. Was the OPW. But we have been asked to set up a flood forecasting center. And we have been looking at different models and different ways of approaching
Yeah.
as to how to deal with this.
Yes, yeah, and in particular to deal with, to create flood resilience, I take it.
Yeah.
Is that within your
No,
remit?
it would be more of forecasting rather than preparing
Yeah,
anything for
yeah,
it resilient.
yeah. Forecasting, yeah. Thank you very much.
Judge, I think that you've probably answered the question there, but this is the question from...
Well, ask it anyway,
yeah,
just.
from table 10 from the
Yeah.
citizens. Does Met Éireann communicate with other government departments like local planning authorities with regard to housing applications or planning in general with a view to minimising future risk of flooding?
Yes.
In relation to flood forecasting, as I mentioned, like we will be setting up a flood forecast center in the next couple of years. But we have been contacting the emergency services whenever we think that there was a warning in relation to rainfall. So in relation to housing and so on, which these are kind of adaptive measures, but we are not heavily involved in these kind of activities.
Yes, I can understand that. Could I just ask, Peter, who carried out the National Flood Resilience Review in the United Kingdom? Which organisation?
It was a collaboration between ourselves at the UK Met Office and the Environment Agency.
Oh, right,
And also an institute called CEH. So it was a collaborative activity in response to the government request.
Yes, very good, very good. Any other question?
Good afternoon, Judge. I'm the facilitator for Table 1. There are 2 questions arising from the table. What exactly is the definition of an extreme weather event, and exactly how much more frequently are these happening? And also, if predictions were to be borne out, how much of Ireland would be underwater? What kind of area would be lost to the sea in the event of such a rise?
Shall I take the first and then the second? It's a really good question, both really good questions. The first one in particular because in order to be quantitative about this, you have to define what you mean by extreme weather event, and it's easy to talk vaguely about such things. I can understand really where that question's coming from, because it's when we do the analysis and when we think about this, we then have to be specific and define what we mean. Now, there are different ways of doing that. I showed one particular example of a study, the one by the Swiss scientists, Fischer and Knutti. They made a particular choice, where they talked about the daily rainfall total, and they talked about whether it was in they looked at, for example, the 1 in 1,000 under past climate conditions. So it's the sort of rainfall over a day you might expect on average every 3 years or so. And they looked at how that would change. That's just one example of a definition. But there are others you could choose, and you might want to choose ones that relate to the effects in terms, for example, in the flooding. So there isn't one standard definition of an extreme weather event. And indeed, I think when we think about how we take the science forward in the communication, I think we need to think about that, actually, about how best we communicate that, because it's used sometimes rather loosely as a bit of a catch-all. But we're thinking about heat waves, we're thinking about floods, we're thinking about droughts, we're thinking about storm surges, for example, and there are different ways of defining those. Usually, though, they are defined in terms of their impact through exceeding some threshold. So, for example, if you think about a storm surge, the water level reaches a particular height that then causes impact. But there's a number of different ways you can define it.
Is there consistency?
Well, there isn't
globally.
There isn't. Well, that's probably not as much as there should be, to be honest. And I think it's something that the scientific community could work more at.
Yeah.
But the only thing to say is that this relates very much to the impact. If we think about risk, we're thinking about how hazard maps onto vulnerability and exposure.
Yeah.
And therefore, different places will have different definitions of what for them is an impact.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Sajid,
Yeah.
your experience.
In relation to the IPCC reports, if if the temperature or the rainfall exceeds certain values. For example, if the temperature exceeds 20 degrees Celsius over a number of days, then we could kind of quantify that as a kind of extreme period. Similarly, with the case of rainfall as well, like very wet days or very wet periods and so on. So the definition is not very standard, and it could vary. And in terms of forecasting, like the definition varies from different Met offices, and an extreme rainfall event for Spain may not be the same as that for Ireland. Thank you.
There was a second question there from that table about how much land we lose to the sea. Yeah.
There was a question about how much land we lose to the sea in Ireland.
Sorry.
Would you?
Repeat
Yeah,
the
you
second
might
question,
repeat.
please.
Repeat the question.
Apologies. The question was, how much of Ireland would be underwater? What kind of an area would we lose to the sea if predictions were to be followed?
Unfortunately, I wouldn't be an expert to make any comments on that.
Yeah. Peter, would you have any general observation?
I suppose the general observation would be the current rate of sea level rise is, as we saw, over 3 millimetres per year, and we heard some. From what I can understand, the sea level rise projections around Ireland are consistent with the global projections of sea level rise.
Yeah.
And of course, the impact also depends on what's done about flood defences in terms of the people who are actually flooded.
So there's no straight answer to it.
That beyond what I've said, I would say yes, because it does also depend, as I say, on the adaptation measures which may or may not be taken around flood defences in terms of what the impacts would be.
Yeah. But that obviously is significant if there have been adaptation measures taken. Yeah.
I'm the facilitator for Table 6. The citizens at this table have 3 questions. The first question is for Peter. Are the recent hurricanes in the Caribbean directly linked to climate change? And question 2 is for Sanjay. Is there a government budget scheme in place long-term for flooding in Ireland? And question 3, the same for Sanjay. Do Met Éireann have a system in place for formal notification provided to local authorities or emergency services on potential extreme weather alerts? And Peter, would there be a system in England similar to this?
Yeah.
For extreme weather.
Well, I think maybe the middle question about whether there's a budget, I think that's probably not for this session.
Okay. So I'll start off on the hurricane question, a really good question. There is quite a lot of scientific interest at the moment in delving into this question. The hurricanes are have a devastating impact, as you've seen, and actually also rather scientifically interesting as well. Scientifically interesting to predict, and actually the weather forecasting models have done really well in predicting the track of the hurricane. That's just one point to note. There are a number of different effects. So first of all, what we know is that the sea surface temperatures were very warm this year. So that provides, if you like, the fuel for the storm. As the temperatures are warmer, there's more moisture to evaporate. There's more energy to feed the storms as they formed. But when we think about hurricanes under climate change, it's actually a topic that generates a lot of vigorous debate in the scientific community because there are actually some competing effects. So first off, sea surface temperatures are rising. That's very clear. And as I said, that has this effect of potentially making hurricanes more intense. But it could be that in terms of the frequency of hurricanes, we could actually be seeing that there isn't an increasing frequency because the structure of the thermal structure of the atmosphere is changing. And for a hurricane, you need there to not be a lot of wind shear that basically stops the hurricane forming. So it looks like potentially at least there may not climate change may not be bringing a dramatic increase in the frequency of hurricanes, but it looks like what climate change is probably doing is making hurricanes more intense, and therefore potentially actually making the most intense hurricanes more likely. Now, in the very specifics of, I mean, it fascinates me this season that we've had so many hurricanes forming at once in the hurricane formation region. I think we've seen 3, 4 or 5 hurricanes, these remarkable satellite pictures of several hurricanes all at the same time. And I think it's going to be interesting to delve into that and see what are the chances of that happening, and whether that's becoming more likely due to climate change. I think what we do know is that this basic thermodynamic argument means that there's a greater risk of the most intense hurricanes.
Very good. Do you want to add anything to that, Saji?
No.
Or would you prefer to go on to the third question?
Yeah, I might address the
in
third
relation
question.
to notification.
Yeah, in relation to communication, like we have a system in place to communicate with the government's emergency management board, and we have the head of forecasting as one of the members. And we also communicate with different government agencies, including the local government, in relation to any emergency related to weather hazards.
Yeah. Does that answer the question? I think it does, yes. Very good.
Hi, I'm Frank from Table 3. Somebody just asked a question, what was the worst case scenario? So I'm going to ask about what's the best case scenario. There were a couple of questions this morning about, how, and you mentioned about reversing the ozone layer, and I know it's a different thing completely, but we had a question on reversing the damage that's been done already in terms of climate change. So my question is, with things being as bad as they are, sea temperatures up, sea levels up, temperature up by 1 degree, rainfall, heat waves, things are bad enough. So we're aiming for them to only be, to go up another degree. So what's the best scenario we can hope for in the short to medium term? It seems like things are going to get worse, really, is what I'm saying.
So it's a really good question. I think also about the best case. The Paris Agreement has committed governments to keep temperatures below, actually it says well below 2 degrees, and to aim to keep temperatures to below 1.5 degrees. So we could think about best case scenario in that context of the Paris Agreement making it, what the Paris Agreement aims to do, and that we do make it to about 1.5 degrees. That is a extremely difficult scenario to achieve. I think there is general consensus, but it may not be impossible. But it would depend very quickly, within years, not decades, a few years even, very quickly turning round for example, our energy generation systems in such a way that we really start to dramatically reduce emissions globally. Because we have, relatively little time to do that. But it's not, I would say that's not impossible. And if we did go to a 1.5 degree world, then, that is a situation where some of the impacts that I showed you at 2 degrees are reduced. And so I showed you the Avoid program, which looked down to 2 degrees, and it showed how many of those impacts are avoided, and there would be even more impacts avoided, if you like, at 1.5 degrees. So that sort of world wouldn't be, I would argue, probably dramatically different from the world we have now, but there would be more floods, there would be more heat waves for us to cope with. That I think is the best case scenario, and that is one that I think under the Paris process, the world is still clinging on to a hope that we might just perhaps be able to do that if we can change our trajectory very quickly and reduce our emissions very quickly.
But would that necessitate all of the members of the Paris Agreement fulfilling their pledge?
It would require more, yes, and it would require more than that.
Yeah.
So just on that quickly, these INDCs, these national contributions would get us to approximately, ballpark figures 3 degrees. So we would need to collectively up the ambition beyond that.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
Yes. Yeah. Saji,
Yeah.
any views on that? Or
So at
any
the
views on best case scenario?
So let's say if we were to stop all greenhouse gases now, and at the moment CO2 at the level of 400 parts per million, and this gas is a long-lived gas, and it would take hundreds of years, maybe even 1,000 years to remove them from the atmosphere. So my view is that even if you stop all the greenhouse gas, particularly CO2, the climate would continue to change. May not be at the rate we see now. Maybe we may be able to limit by less than 1 degree by 2100.
So we have to work a bit harder. Yes, any other questions?
I just think we should get the guy from Dad's Army here. We're all doomed.
Judge and members of the panel, here at table 13, we were looking at the impact which it would have on Ireland. And one of the areas that emerged was the very obvious, earlier this year, the impact on both plant life and animal life. You had on one hand the behavior of birds, particularly in the month of January, and their behavior was much more similar to what it would be like in the month of April. And you had plants beginning to bud in January that normally wouldn't be appearing until the month of March or April. Now, this is not specifically in your area, but I would be interested if you knew of, is there anybody looking at this? Because usually animals are very good to pick up weather conditions, and they react and respond before we do. And secondly, the second point that we wanted to mention, there appears from all the presentations we received today that there is a certain consistency developing in the changing patterns of weather. And if that is the case, well then surely in our agricultural sector, we should be looking at, and it's not off the wall to think, that might we be growing rice in the Shannon Basin, and might Wexford become more famous for Merlot than it is for its strawberries. Thank you.
Yeah.
Wexford Merlot.
Well, this may be a little bit outside your sphere, but would you like to say anything about the changes we saw in the spring of this year in relation to birds and plants?
I might talk in general terms.
Yes.
What we have seen in relation to phenology. Phenology is the study of growing patterns in plants.
Yes.
What we have seen is over the last 50 years, the growing season has increased by something like 4 to 5 days. And in some of the projections which I haven't shown, it shows an increase of at least 30 to 40% compared to what we have seen already. So the growing season is going to increase. But then in terms of the use of different varieties of crops, like I wouldn't be an expert to comment on it. But definitely there's going to be change in the growing patterns as we see changes in the growing seasons.
Yeah. Peter, any observations?
Just to support that really, and these phenological changes are, I mean, you're right, they are quite clear, they're quite strong actually.
And even noticeable to the ordinary person.
Exactly, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Very good. Another question?
Hello, I have a question. Sorry, my name is Mike from Table 5. I just have a question for Sanji. I was wondering, could he tell me just in rough details over the last 10 years how often climate change would be briefed to the Minister for the Environment?
I have
That may require an FOI question.
I've been the head of the research division only since last September, so I wouldn't be in a position to make any comments on that.
Yeah.
Okay, no, well, I'm not saying it's your responsibility to present yourself to him, but presumably the Department of the Environment has a periodic requirement for somebody to talk to them about various things. If not, then they don't.
Yeah.
It's either one thing or the other.
Yeah, I think you might be able to repeat that question and then the next questions and answers session.
Okay.
And more
There was
likely to get an answer.
Okay, a different question then. I recently saw the Al Gore documentary, which was quite powerful in many ways, but one of the very vivid images in it was a comparison between his documentary he did in 2006 versus the one he's just done, and it's highlighted a prediction that they made in 2006 documentary that with a storm surge off New York and high, water levels, etc., as a result of that the 9/11 memorial would be flooded. And a lot of naysayers and people said it was poppycock and it didn't make any sense, not going to happen, etc. And it happened with, Katrina only recently. And there's vivid images of the war pouring into the memorial there. The reason I'm saying this to you is that that in itself is, in terms of a form of communication of what might happen or what can happen as a result of climate change, is very powerful. Is there any way that such plotting of predictions could be translated into maps or in a vivid imagery way, so that instead of people having to become meteorologists to understand what might be happening, that it could be communicated in a more powerful way like that? And it would be a huge benefit, I think, for most people and possibly some politicians to understand what the hell's going on, because there seems to be a deaf ear in a lot of places in authority. So the better the communication, the more the information. Information is power, some people say.
Peter,
yeah. Yes, I absolutely support that, and I think you lay down a fair challenge, actually, to the scientific people like two of us here on this table, to do better on this. And at the UK Met Office Hadley Centre, in our new climate programme, which we do for the under our funders, we are going to seek to improve and enhance the ways that we present information, so that hopefully it will mean more to the policymakers making the decisions. I'm sure there is more that we can do to better and more clearly communicate this, to use better graphics, to use more animated images. I think we saw one or two good examples this morning, actually, of using animations on this. Yeah. So I think this shows that we are starting to do this as a community, and I think Al Gore is pointing us to ways, as you say, that we could do this. So there are some good examples already out there, but I think we can do more as a scientific community to more clearly communicate this stuff. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, and Saji?
Yeah, that's a very relevant point which Meteran is thinking about at the moment. So at the moment we are formulating a new strategy, and one of the main pillars is communication and outreach, particularly in respect to climate and climate services and climate change and so on. And it's very important that we communicate with all strata of the society, and the scientific understanding of the climate science, and thereby trying to get more buy-in from the people and from the politicians and so on. So communication will be a key strategy. Thanks.
Yeah.
There's one other question. Another citizen at the table wanted this question asked. Maybe both of you could have a go at it. It's what effect does atomic testing have on global climate change, i.e. earthquakes?
Is that within?
I think I would just venture to say that they are quasi-independent. So, I mean, that could, so atomic testing, earthquakes, climate change, sort of different things in my understanding. But it's not to say that if there was an earthquake in a place that was already struggling due to climate change, and then that was an additional factor that would affect a place. But clearly that's true. But I would argue that probably they are different things that need to be considered separately.
I suspect so. You probably feel the same way, Saji. Yeah. And it's not really within the scope of what we've been talking about.
Judge, I'm the facilitator for Table 7. One of the citizens has asked me to repeat a question I asked this morning of both gentlemen. If you were in charge, what's the one change you would implement?
Yes, Peter.
Okay. I heard that question this morning. I was thinking, how would I answer that? But no, I didn't have to answer it, so here we are. So, well, first of all, I'm not in charge, thankfully, but I'm just a scientist. But having said that, and just to then go to my own personal experience as an individual citizen, right? So it feels to me like the thing that I would make easier is to, quick story now. I'm moved to Exeter about 3 years ago and need to do renovations to the house, and this is a great opportunity that I want to take to install solar panels and to reduce the carbon footprint of my house. But it feels to me, rightly or wrongly, that this is still a bit of an enthusiast activity. It's still of hard work. The additional efforts that we have to make, and expense that we have to make to do, which we will do, to do this requires an extra level of complexity and complication over and above what we would do as a default option. So it just feels to me as an individual citizen that if this was, and we talked about subsidies earlier this morning, of course, and how subsidies can work, but it's as well as the subsidies, it's also the complexity and that doing things that are helpful to the environment, whether it be how you travel or how you heat your home or whatever, if this becomes mainstream and it becomes the natural thing to do rather than the thing that the enthusiasts do because they want to do it because they're enthusiastic to do it, I think that would help a lot. If this was sort of mainstreamed, I think that for me would be the thing that I would try to do in policy if I was in charge, and I'm not.
Yeah, and how? Can I just ask how you would implement it if you were in charge, and how would you implement that?
Gosh, that feels a slightly unfair question, but I shall have a go. How would I implement it?
Yeah.
Oh, blimey. So I have no idea as to short
There would
answer.
have to be some sort of inducements, will there?
Sorry?
Some sort of inducements.
I think that's right. I think it's partly about how the subsidies work.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it.
Yeah.
But I think the other part is about the complexity and about how in our busy lives, when we're faced with these, we make a decision, but sometimes we don't actually go through with it because it just gets too complicated.
Yes,
so I think the bureaucracy, how we make the bureaucusry work for people, I think that's part of it for me too as well.
Yeah. Saji, what would you do if you were the boss?
We have to bear in mind that any change we make in relation to the reduction of greenhouse gases has an economic cost.
Yeah.
And it cannot be done locally. We have to have a global initiative. Yeah. If UK and Ireland decide that, okay, tomorrow onwards, we are not going to have any more greenhouse gases and we stop all fossil fuels, it's not going to change, or it's going to impact on the overall effect on climate. But if there can be a concerted effort, like we should go for the complete reduction of greenhouse gases, and also keeping in mind that we have to develop greener technologies, that itself can be a big industry. And also we have to leave a good place for our children and grandchildren, and we don't want to mess up our whole environment and the earth, and we have to be responsible in that. And this message should go into each and every one in this world. So it's a very complicated issue.
Yeah. And a balancing exercise. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, we've had a very, very full session, a very, very useful session. I'm very grateful to both our speakers for the presentations, but also for the interaction with the members on the questions. It's been very, very helpful. Thank you very much, and show your appreciation.